I'll be talking for a little bit. And so Oana and Annika asked me to give a bit of an overview of where we're at in entrepreneurship, mental health, and I added well-being. You'll see in a minute why. And I should say, not a lot of this research has actually explicitly dealt with disability in that sense. It has dealt a little bit with disadvantage. And so I'm going to try and give you an overview and point out where there are research opportunities, but generally, independent of the specific research opportunities I point out, you should know that there's a lot of scope to really take the whole conversation around mental health and well-being to kind of frame it a little bit more explicitly, what that means for people who might not, be our kind of typical entrepreneurs, the typical heroic entrepreneurs as we sometimes project them. So there's loads of work to do. And so I'm going to plan talking for roughly half an hour, hopefully not quite as long. Then we'll make a bit of space for questions, but also if you have questions in the meantime, feel free to interrupt me. Then I'll hand over to Eddie, who's going to talk a little bit more specifically about how all this plays out in the social entrepreneurship context and stigma. And then we thought, and there's also going to be, of course, time for questions for Eddie. And then we thought we're going to actually put you into breakout rooms to kind of reflect a bit more on what all of this could mean for your research, which bits and pieces you might find inspiring from both of our presentations to incorporate in your research, and also just give you a bit of time in smaller groups to chat about your research. So with that in mind, hopefully there is some inspiration here for new and exciting, inspiring future research avenues from either of our presentations. Okay, so now enough about setup. I'm, as you see, at King's College. This is actually where my office is in the big building there, Bush House. And I'm talking about mental health well-being in the entrepreneurship. Map that onto sustainable development goals. There are actually 2 sustainable development goals, probably even more, that really apply to this topic. So the 3rd sustainable development goal is all about promoting good health and well-being for all ages, and that's really the core of what a lot of my research is about. And in the entrepreneurship context, that quickly becomes also about decent work and inclusive growth. And then you can extend it because there's also really salient conversations to be had, which we don't have time for today, around mental health, well-being, entrepreneurship, and gender equality, about how we can use this to reduce inequalities, and even of how well-being can be an underpinning resource for building inclusive and peaceful societies. Unfortunately, very topical. Right. I won't bore you too much with kind of papers, but just to say, much of what I say draws on 2 evidence reviews, one systematic review with qualitative synthesis, so really trying to find out what are the drivers of well-being, what are the stressors, and the other one kind of more a meta-analysis, so trying to find out, are entrepreneurs happier? Or will you be happier working for yourself than working for somebody else? But with that aside, I'm aware that not all of you are deeply embedded in the entrepreneurship literature. So just that we're all kind of on the same space. Entrepreneurs we typically refer to as individuals who work for their own account and risk. So it's all about you own the business, the organization, social enterprise, and you control it. And typically you manage it on a daily basis. And so that kind of incorporates everything large and small, from the self-employed small business owners to kind of high growth companies. And just often, especially if you're a well-being researcher with a psychological background as I am, I'm also, why care about entrepreneurs? Why not just care about the employees? And caring about employees is really important, but also caring about entrepreneurs is important because ultimately they are providing the jobs for the employees. They're actually creating the jobs, and they account for a lot of businesses worldwide. 90% of business globally, 70% of employment worldwide. There's a really nice recent report, Small Matters, by the International Organization. And also, in a way, it's very topical because we do see a startup boom triggered by the pandemic. So more people become entrepreneurs for whatever reason. But I think it's important to ask whether, whatever reason why you enter entrepreneurship, whether this can be satisfying, something that makes you happy. And so you can take two perspectives. You can take an enterprise perspective, and then what you really see is many exciting examples of where social enterprises, startup entrepreneurs, small businesses really innovate around the future of work, and with really intriguing examples of creating inclusive organizations that bring in people who might otherwise consider to be, on the outside of the labor market. So if you have autism or somewhere on the autism spectrum, you're much more likely to be unemployed. But if you work at Auticon, then something that's typically considered your weakness actually becomes your strength, because you're very good at data analysis and related IT consultancy tasks. So if you don't know about Auticon, do check them out. They are fantastic, and they're now globally active. So you can take the enterprise perspective, but today I want to take much more the entrepreneur perspective, and that's really about the individual entrepreneur work as a very flexible, autonomous, independent, meaningful work that allows diverse individuals to really tailor work around their needs, and in doing so, hopefully gives them so satisfaction and happiness in their work. And so Sarah, that you see here on the slide, who you see here on the slide, started Wired Differently actually in the pandemic. So she's one of these startup boom pandemic entrepreneurs. And she found that the pandemic and, being confined to home is perfect, because it makes it much easier for her. She's also diagnosed with autism, to organize her work, and her entire business is around how we can bring neurodiverse people into the workplace, but also empower them to be entrepreneurs. And actually for the UK, so we've done a big study on UK data using the big panel data, British socioeconomic panel. And what you see is actually those who have low mental health to select to be self-employed. And again, this is not a value judgment, that's just what we see empirically. And I would even warn that, becoming self-employed, becoming an entrepreneur is no silver bullet. So even though we sometimes celebrate that for, allowing self-actualization, and it can be a source of great happiness, but it's also one of the most stressful occupations there is. And that kind of takes us to kind of mental health and well-being, and just defines health indeed not just as the absence of disease or mental health problems, but as a state of well-being, almost as a thriving, where you fulfill your potential, and you also, interestingly, make a positive contribution to your community. And so what we've been chronically bad at in this research on entrepreneurship, mental health, well-being, is to actually appreciate that there are different components to mental health and well-being. So we can look at more the ill-being, that's more the side that's driven by the stressors, or we can look more at the well-being, that's the side that's really kind of driven by the well-being resources. And so for entrepreneurship research specifically, and that's very different from other types of research, is the possibility that because entrepreneurship is in many ways a much more extreme work-life setting than compared to, having working for somebody else, being independent employment, you actually have both more potential for ill-being due to the high levels of stressors, and also more potential for well-being, for happiness, self-realization, due to all these important well-being resources. And so kind of acknowledging that both might be possible is actually something that we only start to see come through in research, and certainly an opportunity to especially explore how, disadvantaged individuals might be able to cope with that. And then I'm not going to bore you with the very long lists that there are of stressors and well-being resources, but stressors, very prominent ones. Any entrepreneur you ever talk to will say, work just never stops, it's endless, there are long hours, time pressures, you can always do more. It's also very lonely. If you are in a team startup venture, it's maybe less lonely, but then you have also additional stressors coming from team conflicts, and the financial worries that are persistent and pervasive. But there's also much to say for, having the autonomy, the independence to shape your own work, kind of when things go well, because the organization is an expression in it. You have real highs from experiencing these successes. It's very meaningful, purposeful, because you shape the adventure you create, the organization you create, as you like it, and based on around your values and skills and so forth. And so it's really recognizing there are many stresses, there are many resources, and ultimately what you want is a balance of both. Because if both are in balance, then that still means well-being. If stressors outstrip your resources, then that's creating stress over time. And just to say that this is a kind of from the systematic review, there's a list of different work characteristics, personal characteristics, firm financial characteristics, social characteristics, even context characteristics that have been related to well-being. What has been done less is to relate that explicitly to the different types of entrepreneurs we see, more small-scale efforts, more ambitious, growth-focused efforts, and also to consider them together. That's hardly been done. And to really acknowledge that, some of these well-being resources and stresses might configure differently in different contexts. And most of the work has really been done in Western economies, but we do know that that's actually not where most of the world's entrepreneurship happens. So plenty of opportunities, and here is the superwoman or superman. I think one of the underlying things I'm really struck by in this literature is that often, and you actually see that in the numbers, there was, relatively speaking, a lot more research on the positive side of entrepreneurship, on the well-being resources and how being an entrepreneur can be a happy career choice. And it, I think, has to do that we as a society often see entrepreneurs as very heroic individuals who are very resilient and can juggle all of these things. But that means that we're underappreciating the stressors, and we're often not considering both together, even though it's the balance really that gives us well-being. And that takes me to the well-being paradox, or recall, together with colleagues, of course. And what you have is almost, if you talk to entrepreneurs, it's quite interesting how much this resonates. You have on average, achievement-oriented, confident individuals who start businesses. If they were not achievement-oriented, they probably would choose another means of earning a living. And you do not have a fixed goal, right? You can always do more, you can always do better, you can create, either you can satisfy more beneficiaries if you're leading a social enterprise, or you can enhance your market share even further if you're a commercial one, also for social ones. It's like Mount Everest, right? There's always more room to the top. And then you have that together with intense work and self-organized work. And that basically means that this is almost a toxic combination whereby you end up over-exploiting yourself. Work-life boundaries become very fluid because you are work and work is you. You extend work into the evenings. You don't give yourself space to recover from the work. And so what we see is that entrepreneurs subjectively are happier because they're often, they're really invested in the work they are doing. But we also see some evidence that physiologically they're more stressed and more vulnerable to illnesses. And that's particularly so in more in contexts where there's more uncertainty. And so that is really quite worrying, because we know that these early indicators really lead to severe illness and to death. And so we don't want to, want entrepreneurs to not being able to sustain their organizations for themselves and for others. So this is really something that needs addressing. But before I get to, I just want to also highlight that, as you've seen so far, I talked about the antecedents or drivers of entrepreneurs' well-being. Actually, and you see the number of studies in the systematic review here at the bottom, there's much less research understanding the consequences of entrepreneurs' well-being. So why does entrepreneurs' happiness matter? Of course, it matters to the entrepreneurs themselves, but it also matters for the organization. So this link between, it's not just nice to have, it's not just nice to be happy and to be thriving in your work, it's actually also good for your business. So we see that if you're, I'm just going to use the shorthand, if you're happy as an entrepreneur, you're more likely to spot opportunities, you're more likely to be more proactive, you spend more time, gives you more persistence, and your firms or organizations end up being performing better. But as you see the numbers here, the number of studies that looked into this, there's really much more that can be done. We know from other research, typically on employees, that well-being is really important mental well-being is really important also for physical well-being, but that's hardly been recognized in the entrepreneurship context. So more opportunities for future research, and also kind of this idea of feedback loops, right? Entrepreneurship can be very dynamic. It's not like a 9-to-5 job where your manager kind of steers your workload. And these feedback loops, what it means if your firm is doing well, what that means for your well-being, how that shapes how your work looks like, maybe even confirming your identity, all of this is very much underexplored. And then, yeah, in the interest of time, I just want to highlight that what's also really, really underexplored is how mental well-being of the entrepreneur really impacts the others around the entrepreneur. There's a little bit of evidence on, happy entrepreneurs also kind of have, or actually rather stressed entrepreneurs can be really difficult to live with in terms of family. So that also, unfortunately, still partners. But considering that, what we like entrepreneurs for from an economic perspective is that they create jobs, we actually have very little research that looks at how the well-being of the entrepreneurs impacts their employees. And even in the wider leadership research, it's only now that we're starting to recognize that happy leaders make for better leaders. And so, all of this really has to be explored. And just because sadly, there is a big war on at the moment, but actually one really interesting study related entrepreneurs' mental well-being to increased tolerance in society, and that was a study in Rwanda post the genocide. And in that sense, I thought, well-being can be also maybe a positive pathway to more collective outcomes that we care about. Right. I like to talk about well-being too much, so I keep on talking a little bit longer. So most of the research, and I know we all have resource constraints, including us as researchers, takes snapshots, right, of entrepreneurs' well-being, and then relates that maybe to their outcomes or looks at drivers of well-being, at one point in time. But for better or worse, the entrepreneurial life, I think, is much more closer to a roller coaster than to a steady ship. And so you see Elon Musk has this one quite like, because it illustrates both the dynamism that's inherent in entrepreneurship, the great highs, the terrible lows, but it also shows that even he thinks it's not acceptable for entrepreneurs to talk about their vulnerabilities. And if you know him a bit, with the story that, his lack of well-being, his problem sleeping, he takes sleep medication, so forth, have led to quite severe consequences. He was removed as the CEO of Tesla. They had to pay a hefty fine, and he really attributed that in one interview to his being stressed and lack of well-being. So there are real consequences of entrepreneurs not being able to talk about well-being, and also maybe not always recognizing that their well-being is important for their business. But so these dynamics, these roller coaster rides are hardly evident in our research. It makes sense that entrepreneurs' life is very variable, very dynamic, because ultimately, they are in charge of creating and shaping their work, and that has consequences for well-being, which we still have to understand. And just to give you some examples, I'm not going to expand on very much, but questions that we haven't been able to answer very well yet is for how long any well-being benefits of entrepreneurship might last. So given you start a business, you're going to be happier only the first 2 or 3 years, or is this going to last for 5 years if you make it to that point? Hopefully you do. How does the stress manifest? We know that stress is a silent killer. At first, you don't notice it. You might be still subjectively happy, but your body, starts to feel a wear and tear. That then can turn into, substance abuse as a means of coping with all the emotions and stress there is, that could over time lead to burnout, and then manifest in even more significant mental health challenges that, if you think depression has quite a high suicide rate. So, quite lethal mental health challenges, really. And then what happens when there are triggers, and what are the triggers? So COVID has, for all its bad effects, negative effects, has given us an insight into just how important crises are and how they're shifting well-being, and also how pre-existing well-being can be a buffer to be able to deal with crisis much better. And then maybe variability in well-being in itself is an important variable we should look at. And because if you have to regulate your emotions up and down, there's a great study by Marilyn Uy and colleagues, then that in itself is energy consuming and kind of difficult to maintain over time. And then there's also little understanding not just of the variability and dynamics in entrepreneurs' well-being, but also in how their work might actually change. Indeed, most of our research often assumes that they've created the organization and that's how work looks like. But stakeholders start to renegotiate things. If you're successful, they might want more from you. They might want to give you more money to expand. But is that actually good for your well-being? Maybe you want to delegate some of the work. How do you do that? So, there's always new demands. We know already that there is significant variation in stressors, much less what happens to the resources. And also very little about how entrepreneurs actually make these decisions. So when do they start to delegate? How do they organize their work? And why do they do so? Maybe if we understand those mindsets behind that, we can also help entrepreneurs to create their, let's say, more efficient organizations that allow them to thrive and others to thrive. Right. Just to highlight one really exciting research method are diary studies that really allow to capture well-being real life. So they're very close to entrepreneurs' real life, that are conceptually interesting because you can uncover, unpack micro-level processes and really get to the micro foundations of entrepreneurship research, the different ways of how you can do them. And if you're interested in them, I put at the end of the presentation a whole lot of resources, not too many, just the ones I find most useful. And I'm very happy to have conversations about that. So I want to leave you with a more positive note. Now, having outlined that maybe being an entrepreneur can be quite a vulnerable occupational choice, and there is this well-being paradox to be negotiated. Actually, together with Amanda Williamson and Jeff Gish, we started to think through, so what's then the solution? So how can we help support entrepreneurs? And we came up with the 3 R's: respite, reappraisal, regimen. All are around the idea that in order to lead your business well, you need to invest in self-care, and self-care is a broad label for you need to invest and give your time, your body time, to recover from the work stress, and you need to do that regularly. The good news is it's actually not as time-consuming as it sounds. It can be just the little things, but the little things you do daily and that become part of the routine and really make a difference because they disrupt this physiological buildup of stress and make you not just happier, but also make you more productive. So in a sense, self-care also makes business sense because we see that entrepreneurs who sleep better, for instance, have more high-quality sleep, either self-reported or kind of tracked with sleep trackers objectively, have more ideas, creative ideas the next day, are more innovative, spot more opportunities. And so there is another research opportunity here because whilst there is a large body of research on recovery of employees typically, that really underappreciates the important effects recovery can have for productivity. While the effects on well-being are well documented, this link from recovery is not just good for well-being, it also actually helps you to be more productive and efficient in your work, is something that really needs a bit more unpacking. And I think when you talk to entrepreneurs, they find that argument very convincing. Not just that it makes them not just more productive, it also maybe and the benefits of to more beneficiaries. Should you need more inspiration for your future research, here are some papers. So in my own papers, together also with Andreas Rauch and Isabella Hatak, we have compiled nice lists of future research areas, and I talked through some of those, but I also want to acknowledge that there are, of course, others who really do great work on this topic. Olivier Torres and Roy Thürig have small business owners in health, so a bit more focus on the health element. and have really nice research ideas there. And of course, there's also the Journal of Business Venturing special issue on entrepreneurship and well-being that still serves as a source of inspiration. Thank you very much. I hope you like getting a bit of an insight into well-being, and hopefully I've managed to lay out at least some inspiring new research ideas. And any questions, please ask.